Hi, everyone. My name is Maria Golden, and I am a project manager at Dovetail Partners and will be helping to facilitate this webinar. Welcome to our Q2 webinar on tree-free hemp and non-wood alternatives. Before we begin, I did want to remind you all to register for our remaining webinars by scanning the QR code on the screen or using the link in the chat. We will have a Q&A session at the end, so please submit your questions in the QA box as we go along. So a little bit about us. Dovetail Partners is a nonprofit organization that provides authoritative information on the impacts of environmental decisions. We're joined today by our Dovetail president, Kathryn Fernholz, and two Dovetail associates, Jim Bowyer and Mark Jacobs. Jim Bowyer is Professor Emeritus at the University of Minnesota Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering. He is an elected fellow of the International Academy of Wood Science and an expert in environmental life cycle assessment. He has published on the topics of wood and fiber science, bioenergy, life cycle assessment, green building standards, global raw material trends, and environmental policy, and is a frequent speaker on these topics. Mark Jacobs served as land commissioner for Aiken County in north central Minnesota for 13 years and has a total of almost 39 years of experience in public land management and forestry in the Lake States. During his tenure, Aiken County was recognized as one of the first public land managers to achieve third-party certification through the Forest Stewardship Council. He brings expertise in public forest management, environmental concerns in the Lake States region, and experience across the spectrum of silviculture, forest certification, carbon offsets, and environmental education. Kathryn Fernholz is a forester by training with over 25 years of experience in the forest and forest products sector. She has worked on environmental issues in a range of roles, including environmental assessments, permitting, and GIS analysis. Her career has focused on sustainability concerns, including leadership on family forestry, community-based decision-making, forest certification, and environmental standard setting. From here, I'll hand it over to Jim Bowyer to get us started.
Thank you, Maria, and good morning to those who have joined us today. This session is going to focus on tree-free fiber, hemp, and other non-wood alternatives. And this presentation will focus on alternative fiber for making of paper, although there are a number of reasons and applications for alternative fiber. Paper is the area where there is the most concentrated effort to make a replacement within what has been a wood-dominated industry. We're going to look primarily at environmental impacts related to alternatives and fiber substitution. And although we're going to focus on paper, the discussion here has implications for any substitution that might be considered and the things that need to be considered before that substitution is made. What we'll talk about here this morning, we'll start with a bit of a historical background, look at market trends. We're going to spend a bit of time just talking about basics of the paper industry and then forest and forest trends within the U.S. Then we'll look at drivers of interest in alternative fiber and then go right into environmental impact comparisons before we go to a closing and a summary. So let's talk a little bit about the history. Paper goes way back to 105, the year 105. In China, the inner bark of mulberry trees and later bamboo fiber were used in making a crude form of paper. Sometime later, over 800 years later, the use of linen rags was introduced, and that continued for another 950 years. And some of those linen rags actually were made out of hemp. Rags clothing was made out of hemp, and then when those rags became used for paper, the fiber in those became used for paper, you'll see sometimes the claim made that hemp was used in making paper as long as 1,000 years ago. Well, that's true, in the fact that those fibers became part of paper. Sometimes rag fiber was supplemented by straw, and you can still make fiber out of straw today if that's what you want to do. The pulping of wood for paper making began around 1850, and that technology soon spread around the world, including to the United States, around 1855, 1860, began to see wood-based paper in the United States. And the effect of that was it greatly improved the availability of fiber, and therefore the price was considerably lower. So it's not surprising that wood-based papermaking really took off after that point in time. um, in areas where characterized by limited forest resources, many of those areas have long used wood fiber for producing paper, as in the example of bagasse, esparto grass, bamboo, jute, even other kinds of fibers, including straw. Um, but the fact of the matter today is that about 97% of paper is made of wood fiber, again, because of relative abundance and technologies for fiber conversion. In the United States, another driver for interest in alternative fiber was the farm industry, and the agriculture industry in the United States is constantly looking for ways to diversify markets, expand ways that they could uh, accentuate farm income. And so the USDA in the mid 50s set about looking for alternative fiber crop, and the initial focus was on alternative fiber for making paper. Over 400 fiber plants were studied. And then through extensive testing, the list was reduced to 61 and then down to six. And finally, Knopf emerged as the top candidate. So we'll talk a little bit about Knopf today. But I should say that because hemp was illegal in the United States all through this period, that was not one of the plants or fibers studied. So today in the United States, and we'll talk about hemp more in just a second, but the most common alternative paper-making fibers that are promoted in the US are hemp, kenaf, and sometimes you'll see advertisements for bamboo, but that would come almost exclusively through imports and in the form of specialty papers. So let's look at markets for just a minute. And here's where hemp comes into play. Um, Throughout that USDA study, hemp was not part of it, but in 2018, the 2018 Farm Bill legalized cultivation under specific conditions, and specifically what was legalized was fiber hemp. Um, and the focus was on industrial products like fiber, in some cases grain, and CBD, cannabis oil products. That's an oil-like substance that's used in some medicinal applications. Um, so that's 2018. That market is young, of course. It's faced early challenges such as overproduction and regulatory uncertainty. Uh, some of that regulatory uncertainty is more clear today, less uncertainty in the market. But that's led to fluctuations in acreage and production levels, and that's an industry that's still struggling to get started in the U.S. Um, but the market's expected to experience significant growth over the next few decades, and the projection is even that this could grow at an annual rate of over 20% up through 2030, um, reaching around a $6 billion dollar market by that time. Um, so there's rising demand in industries such as textiles, construction, personal care, and so on and so on. You don't see pulp and paper listed on this list. However, it is an area that hemp producers are continuing to seek to gain a foothold in. And we're going to talk a lot more about that shortly. Whereas the industry is kind of still struggling to get started, in Canada, uh, they legalized hemp a full 20 years before the United States did. And the industry there has grown steadily with a focus on things like hemp seeds and oil. Um, but they also, it's an industry that's focused on developing um, fiber applications for industry and textiles and bioplastics and things like that. Um, so really an indication of there is a market existing for hemp. It appears to be growing. It has the potential to grow rapidly. All right, we're going to spend a couple of minutes looking just briefly at some of the realities of the paper industry in North America. We'll talk a little bit about forests and forest trends. And so to start with, let's just talk about, well, where is it that fiber comes from in the making of paper? And the best way, I guess, to look at that is this. This is a glimpse of the U.S. South in 2022. And I just picked the U.S. South because this is the primary paper making region of the United States. About two-thirds of paper is produced in that region. Um, so here's where the fiber comes from. The biggest single source is recovered fiber. In the United States, about two-thirds of fiber paper is recovered for recycling. Some of that is lost in the process of pulping, taking it back to fiber, and then reuse. Some of it is exported. But at the end of the day, around 45, actually in 2022, 42% of fiber that went into paper making in the United States was recovered fiber. The next biggest source is softwood roundwood. This is pulpwood logs. And then you see there was a certain amount of hardwood, roundwood. And then the other sources of raw material is residue from sawmills. When a round log is converted into square lumber, there are rounded, half-rounded edges that come off. Those are typically chipped, and the chips from that process go to paper mills that is used to make paper. That's a very high quality raw material because the longest length fibers are actually on the outside of a log. And so that's very much coveted raw material coming from sawmills. So that's where fiber comes from to make paper. And uh, the exact ratio of different inputs will vary across the country, but that's a pretty good indication of what uh, the fiber source looks like. As the papers that are produced, the vast majority is something called container board, that's shown in red. This is the board that's made for corrugated boxes and things like that, large shipping containers. This paper requires it's very high strength. It's typically 100% made of very long fibered softwood. And then you see other types of papers that are shown here. Printing and writing papers in the darker green. Box board is up here. This is a product more like cereal boxes and other kinds of things that can make use of shorter types of fibers. And then you can see other types of papers shown here. Packaging paper, again, is a paper that is made pretty much exclusively of very long fiber softwood. This little bitty slice you see here, you might be looking at this and say, where is newsprint? There's where newsprint is in the big picture. It's become a very small part of paper production. So one of the big drivers of interest in paper made of non-wood fiber is that fears of the forests of the United States and of Canada are disappearing. And we'll focus on the US here. Um, And this is a notion that's really promoted by those who are pushing alternative fiber for making a paper. We're going to find out here in just a minute that the forests of the United States are, in fact, not disappearing. But anyway, this is a widespread fear and one that continues to be pushed in advertising. Uh, Here's forest land area in the United States going all the way back to 1630. And at the beginning, when people first came from Europe, there was over 1 billion acres of forest in the United States. And there was a great deal of forest loss in clearing for agriculture, first and foremost. Quite a dramatic drop. But since that time, there's been a remarkable stability in the area of forest land in the United States. Um, to the extent that forest land is being lost, there's a continual turnover at the margins of farmland reverting back into forest land and vice versa. So you'll see this waxing and waning of the area of forest land. But to the extent that forest land is being lost, almost all of that is being lost to urban expansion. Uh, Really, none of it is being lost due to forest harvesting for producing of forest products such as pulp and paper. 1/3 of our forest land is reserved and not available for timber harvesting. The other 2/3 is available for periodic harvesting, at least theoretically. Who owns the forests? You can see that private land, either in non-corporate or corporate lands, makes up a good part of our forests. 58% of our forest lands are privately owned, and private non-corporate includes tribal lands. Federal owned land would include that managed by the U.S. Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, the military, and some other types of ownership. And then a small amount of forest land is owned by the state. Here in Minnesota, we have quite a bit of state managed forest land. So 58% of forests are privately owned. Now, of that 58% of land, 90% of the wood harvested for use by the forest industry comes from that 58% of U.S. forest land. So that's a number we'll come back to in a little while. Just keep in mind, 9 out of 10 tons of wood that's harvested by the forest industry comes from private land. Another broad misperception about forests is that more wood is removed from forest every year than is produced by new growth. And in fact, exactly the opposite is true. If if what is considered as total removals of trees from forests, and that includes lands being cleared for shopping centers and highways and everything else, including all harvesting that's done for production of forest products, the fact is that far more wood is added each year to forests than is removed. And you can see that in these ratios. Net forest growth, that's forest growth minus all removals that might occur from those factors we just talked about, plus fire, insects, decay, all that kind of thing. Net forest growth is about 1.7 to 1 for softwoods. Um, in hardwoods, the ratio is even higher, about 2.3 to 1. Um, that's quite a ratio. We're adding, in the case of hardwoods, more than twice as much than is coming out of the forest every year. And so the way that shows up is that standing timber volume in the United States is increasing steadily. Um, if you just look at this trend, look back to where we were in 1952 and where we are today, um, if you go back to 1970 and look at a compound annual growth, the compound annual growth here is about 1.1% per year. That translates to about a 70-year doubling time. If you put your money in the bank at 1.1%, left it there, and just let it grow at a compound rate of 1.1%, you would double in about 70 years. That's the trajectory we're on in the forest of the United States today. And while you can think about this, you think, well, if we remove more than we're adding through new growth, that's clearly not sustainable. If we're adding growth to forest on a continuing trajectory, making those forests more and more dense with greater and greater volume, you might ask yourself, is that sustainable over the long run? And I think upon reflection, you'd quickly determine that that's not sustainable either. um, because we're increasing steadily the growth in the standing volume in forests, we're increasing the carbon storage on the land in the form of forests. This is the forests in the United States are hardwood or a carbon sink. And you can see that this is the above ground portion of trees. This is total forest carbon inventory. And again, you can see that the carbon inventory in our forests is increasing. Okay, let's come back to this business of drivers of interest in alternative fiber. we talked about the USDA initiative starting in the mid-1950s that led to identification of kanaf. And the whole purpose of that initiative was to try to find additional sources of farm income. So that's a driver, and it has been in the United States and continues to be today. There are different projects going on right now that are funded by USDA to look at uh, potential production of fiber on on agricultural land. But another driver is concern about the environment and forest loss. And we're going to focus on that a bit. I mentioned earlier that those companies and groups that are promoting alternative fiber to wood in papermaking very often push on the idea that forests are disappearing, that biodiversity is lost when harvesting is done, and so on. And you see that very much in advertising today. In the next couple of slides, I'll just show you some statements that I just found out on the web looking the last few days from companies that make tree-free paper or those that are striving to get into the market. So you'll see statements like this: tree-free paper saves 32 trees. Um, a renewable resource that matures in just months, unlike forests that take multiple decades to grow. We're going to look at that claim pretty closely here when we get into environmental comparisons. Around 4 billion trees are lost every year due to paper production, leads to deforestation, and so on and so on. Trees and forests serve as carbon sinks, and when their numbers reduce, it affects the ecosystem. In other words, what's being promoted here is the idea is when trees are cut down, the carbon sinks are destroyed, and furthermore, it affects the ecosystem adversely, so on and so on. So these are the claims that are out there, and the concerns that are raised in these claims are certainly things that people would be concerned about if they were true. And so to some extent, in some markets, I guess these kind of statements ring true, and they will help drive people to seek out these alternative paper markets. So let's go straight into some environmental impact comparisons. We've talked about uh, sources of fiber used in paper manufacturing, both here and in the US and globally. Recovered fiber, sawmill residues are big components. But then there is roundwood, and that can come from managed sawtimber plantations, in which plantations are grown for the purpose of producing logs big enough to make lumber, with then uh, periodic thinnings done in those stands that are going to make chips that then go to make paper. That would be one source. Another source would be intensively managed pulpwood plantations, managed very much like an agricultural crop in a very agriculturally intense kind of environment. And then natural forests, which are not plantations, but simply natural forests where periodic harvesting is done. So let's look at those, and we'll start by looking at intensively managed pulpwood plantations, and then we'll look at managed sawtimber plantations, and then natural forests. So here we have on the right is an intensively managed pine plantation. You can see these trees, lots of trees planted in a small area. Those are allowed to grow for a short period of time. Then some of them are thinned out, and then the rest are grown to 20 or 25 years and harvested, and the fiber is taken from them. On the other hand, an annual crop of hemp um, produces a certain amount of fiber. So we're going to compare these two strategies for producing fiber, and we'll look at the environmental implications of doing this one way versus the other. So here is a summary of what it takes to grow hemp. And um, like any form of agriculture, there's site preparation and field cultivation. Hemp is a plant that is very prone to damage from too much moisture at the roots and so forth. So sometimes, in fact, often, the recommendations for Site preparation is to create raised beds where seeding can be done. Um, that's not always the case, but it is a recommendation. Site preparation is followed by seeding. That seeding might be preceded by pre-plant fertilization. Fertilization might come shortly after seeding. And then it's recommended that there be a couple of additional fertilization cycles. In fact, some sites recommend every 4 to 6 weeks of fertilization be added. The growth cycle here would be somewhere around probably 18 weeks would be typical. Um, Typically, 2 to 3 applications of herbicides are needed throughout a crop cycle. Pesticides as well, 2 to 3 applications. And then at the point where these stems are ready to harvest, the harvesting comes along. And then there's a retting drying process. Drying is often done by simply piling the stems in the field in long rows, turning the piles periodically to let them dry, and then taking them in a processing plant. And that can involve multiple passes across the landscape if that's the approach used. Stems can also simply be harvested and taken to a plant where processes take place there without counting the multiple passes that might be involved in retting and drying. Site intervention in a given year, just to raise one crop of hemp, would be somewhere around 13 to 16 times. All right, well, let's compare that to growing southern pine in an intensively managed manner. So again, we've got site preparation to get ready to plant and then planting. And again, there could be use of herbicides. In fact, it's common. Often these herbicides would be added pre-planting. Um, and then fertilization is recommended at year 1. And here's one example in years 4 and 8. Other uh, stands might use fertilization at years 5 and 9 or whatever, but a couple of additional fertilizations during a cycle. Um, Pesticides may or may not be needed, but if they are, they're typically seldom more than one time. Here's a stand growing on a 25-year cycle. So the recommendation is to thin at year 15 and then to harvest at year 25. So in the previous slide, we saw that we'd have somewhere around 13 to 16 times in 1 year. In this case, looking at southern pine, we're looking at 10 to 14 times across the landscape in 25 years. Oh, quite a big difference. So hemp over a 25-year period, growing 25 annual crops, somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 to 400 passes across the landscape, very likely closer to that 400 number. Growing that crop of intensively managed pulpwood and southern pine over a 25-year period would require going across the site, intervening on the site, somewhere around 10 to 14 times total. And that's a summary of this here. Um, Very large differences. And Kanaf, by the way, very similar kind of picture. It's a very similar plant to hemp, and the requirements for growing are quite similar. Kanaf is a little bit more resistant to pesticides or to pests, and so the need for pesticides probably would be lower. 300 plus, I indicated the interventions on the land would be probably closer to 400 than 300. Now, in addition to all that, irrigation is recommended for raising of both hemp and kanaf, but is not needed in pine plantations. In fact, is really never used in pine plantations. All right, so what do you get at the end of this time? In hemp, at come harvest time, counting the stalk plus the leaf, about 3.5 to almost 8 tons per acre per year. And if the leaves are removed, not considering the leaves, the stalk only, which is really where fiber is going to come from, somewhere in the range of 3 to 6 tons per acre per year. And these are short tons per acre per year. All right, what about in southern pine? When we get all the way to the end of a cycle and we we add up all of the tonnage that comes off an acre and then divide that by the amount of time we had growing, in this case 25 years, it turns out that the fiber yield from an intensively managed southern pine site is around 4 to 7 tons per acre per year. So remarkably similar to what you see here. And if you look at the stems themselves, range here is around 3 to 6, range here is around 3 to 6. So very similar yields in tons per acre per year, but with considerably different needs for intervention on the land over that 25-year period. All right, so let's look at hemp versus managed long rotation pine plantations. And on the right, we're looking at a plantation now. This plantation is going to be grown for a period of more like 35 to 50 years. That plantation will start out with dense plantings, and then there will be multiple thinnings along the way. Those thinnings, which will remove smaller trees and less, better, well-formed trees, are then taken out of the stand. They're chipped. They're used for pulpwood or for energy. And then by the end of the rotation period, the larger stems are harvested for saw logs, a saw log being a log that is large enough to saw into lumber. Um, and again, we're going to compare to a number of annual crops of hemp. Um, so let's consider a plantation managed for saw timber for 35 years with thinnings at age 15 and 25. And you can get a notion for, here's a stand that's late in the rotations, not too far from coming up for that saw timber harvest. All right, growing that southern pine stand, again, we got site preparation and herbicides and planting and seeding and so forth. Fertilization, not quite as intense as in a very intensively managed short rotation stand. Fertilization at year 1 and year 15. May or may not use pesticides, 2 thinnings, and then harvest at year 35. Over that 35-year period on the site, somewhere around 9 to 13 times. So here is a longer rotation site. And again, you compare the numbers. Here the numbers are for 25 years. I've left those at 25 years. This is over 35 years. And again, you see this vast difference between inputs needed for fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, interventions in the site. Vast, vast differences. And so you look at these differences and we say, okay, from an environmental point of view, which one of these is better? This is one measurement or 4 or 5 measurements to give you an indication of which one is better. And then again, irrigation is recommended, but not in pine plantations. So now let's look at crop yields as we did before. In this longer rotation pine, a thinning at year 15 yields around 17 and 24 tons. Um, uh, Pulpwood at the 25-year thinning, another 24 to 40 tons. And then saw logs at the 25-year thinning, a few of those logs will be big enough to convert into lumber, but not very many. And then at 35 years, there'll still be some pulpwood in that stand. And the wide division here between these two numbers depends upon what portion, if the pulpwood yield is this, then the saw timber yield would be that. If the pulpwood yield is this, then you'd get less in the way of saw log, something like that. But in any case, this is what you'd get. And so you look at overall fiber yield, somewhere around 3.5 to 5 tons. Remember the earlier numbers for hemp was 3 to 6, basically, 3.8 to 6.2 tons per acre per year. So by managing this way, the yield of fiber is lower, but the impact upon the land is far lower as well. The overall fiber yield here, 3.5 to 5 tons per acre per year. We'll just touch briefly on fiber harvest from natural forests, especially in northern regions and in the Pacific Northwest. You might see more of this kind of thing. If you're harvesting from a natural forest and it's not being fertilized and a great deal of management being practiced, then the yields are quite a bit lower than they would be in an intensive agricultural setting. Yields can be 3 to 4 times greater for hemp uh, than they are in managing than obtaining fiber this way from the natural forest. But on the other hand, the impacts to land are even greater than have been talked about earlier. So we have down here these two pictures to the bottom left. In fact, I guess all of these pictures are taken in by native Minnesota here, and they show pulpwood coming out of mixed stands of spruce and aspen. And so we look at the number of site interventions and fertilization and herbicide applications that are needed here in these last two instances. Um, these forests are basically left untouched up to the point of harvest, and then they are left to regrow. They're either replanted or left to regenerate naturally, which is the way most forests are regenerated actually, and far lower impacts on the land than what we see here. So here's a summary of inputs over a 25-year period, and you can see the differences here and the number of site treatments over a given period of time. Vast, vast differences. All right, so finally, let's look at characteristics of the harvested crop. Here is a depiction of a hemp stem. Um, Bast fiber is really the creme de la creme of a hemp plant. These are the very long fibers found on the outside of a stem. These are the sought after fibers that could compete conceivably with softwood fiber in making of container board, for example, of packaging papers and things like that. But they only make up about 20 to 30% of the stem volume. Um, that's a marked disadvantage of these stems, as we'll talk about in comparison to wood. On the other hand, the cellulose content is very, very high, 74%, which is higher than what you find in wood. So those two things, the fact that there is very long fiber out here and it's got a high cellulose content is a very good feature of hemp. On the other hand, the whole middle of this thing, down to a center core, is a very, very short fiber, even shorter than the short fibers of hardwoods, hardwood trees. And that has a cellulose content of around 44 to 45%. So there are ready markets for this long bast fiber, and that fiber can be longer than the long fibers of softwood. But there is a struggle for markets for all of this stuff in the middle. And there are certainly uses for this very short fiber, but um, even with the relatively small amount of hemp that is produced today, the nascent industry is really struggling to find uses for this short fiber. Now let's compare that with southern pine. In a southern pine stem of any size at all, long fibers comprise virtually all of the stem volume. In the juvenile core, which can be the first 5 to 7 growth rings, in some cases as many as 10 or more growth rings, in that case, the juvenile fiber is shorter than the fiber you find on the outside, as much as 30% shorter. Having said that, even fiber in the juvenile core is quite a bit longer than the fiber that would be found in a stalk of hemp in the center portion of a stalk of hemp. So relatively long fiber throughout the stem. The further you get toward the outside, the higher the quality of the fiber in that it's longer. And that's why that the slabs, the residues from sawmills is so much sought after. So we look at this, 20 to 25% of a hemp stem would be that long fiber. So after pulping with a cellulose content about 70%, you'd get a yield of somewhere around 14 to 18% fiber. If the entire stem were pulped chemically, you'd get a yield of about 50% fiber. Um, if the whole stem were pulped mechanically, which is just using mechanical energy to separate this thing in fiber, you'd get a quite high yield. You'd get somewhere around 80 to 90% fiber yield. But chemically, these are the yields you'd get. And this is the most common form of conversion to fiber. In southern pine, the yield of long fiber as a percent of the main stem is about 50% overall, um, about 50% in southern pine, overall yield of about 50%. So in other words, the yields here are if we're talking about chemical pulping, the chemical pulping yield of southern pine would be about 50% as opposed to a much lower yield if we're talking about long fiber and so forth. If you're talking about total amount of fiber, then the yields would be very similar. It's just that this fiber is much more preferred for a great proportion of the paper that's made today. The short fiber from both of these can be used in making things like printing and writing papers and so on. However, the short fiber of hemp is shorter than the fiber of even hardwood trees, but nonetheless, these could conceivably compete with each other in that market. Okay, so let's just summarize. It's important to recognize, sometimes lost sight of the fact in the hype of advertising, that all raw materials result in environmental impacts when they're sourced. It's just the reality of life. So when we're trying to determine which might be better, which technology might be better, which fiber source might be better, which raw material might be better, you really need systematic assessment to avoid unintended consequences, to get it right. And choosing among options for paper-making fiber really requires careful thought, as I've tried to point out here. Intuition is almost always wrong when trying to make decisions like this. Um, so just to summarize, a far greater number of site interventions are associated with intensively managed hemp and canaf than with plantation trees, which are also really managed form of forestry. Um, Wood fiber is produced with comparatively low inputs of fertilizers and chemicals of all kinds. And one of the things that's often brought up when talking about tree plantations is that people simply say tree plantations are monocultures. Well, they could be. Uh, Tree plantations are sometimes different types of genotypes are planted so that they're not genetically identical trees within a plantation. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But the whole issue of genetic diversity within a stand overall, which is to say the flora and fauna other than the crop that's being raised, um, in both cases, raising agricultural crops, there's much lower biodiversity than if this were a natural grassland. In the case of a tree plantation, biodiversity is less than if that were a natural forest. But studies have shown that biodiversity in tree plantations is not vastly lower than a natural stand, especially if these plantations are grown to longer rotations, um, as was shown in the one example. Um, so lower biodiversity in both, but certainly not zero, and there's no clear advantage one way or the other. If there is an advantage, it's on the side of tree plantations. Um, Continuing to summarize, dry biomass yields from pine plantations are very similar to those of hemp and canaf, even though you're only harvesting once or just a few times rather than 25 or however many years we're talking about. And Uh, Chemical pulping yields are far greater from wood than from canaf. Overall pulp yields, if we're talking mechanical pulping, would be quite similar. All right, well, just in the way of wrapping up here, I want to pose a question to everyone who's listening this morning. Um, let's suppose that proponents of, let's say, hemp were so successful in promoting hemp as an alternative fiber that the American public decided they're not going to buy any more paper made out of wood. No more wood fiber. We're simply going to make it out of hemp. And in fact, if we can find a way to do it, we're going to use hemp to make lumber. There is a hemp lumber product out on the market right now, by the way. We're going to use hemp to make lumber. We're going to use hemp to make paper, everything we can think of. And so we're going to completely or largely replace wood fiber. So the question to you is, if that were to happen, and if that did happen, of course, it would mean that there would be far fewer trees harvested for making of paper and all kinds of other stuff. So if we harvested far fewer trees, would that mean that we have greater forest area and more trees? And intuitively, you might think, well, sure, if we're cutting fewer trees, absolutely, we'd have more forest area and more trees. Well, in thinking about this, remember that about 90%, over 90% of wood fiber comes from privately owned forests. And a lot of that forest land, people are managing those forests as an alternative source of income. So if markets for wood go away and you own a certain amount of land and you got this crop on there that nobody wants anymore, are you going to keep the trees on the land? Are you going to sell it off to urban development or cabin development? Are you going to harvest it and replace it with a crop of something like hemp? What are you going to do? And I think one way to think about this is, let's suppose everybody in the world decided we're going to save carrots. We really like carrots. We're going to save them. And so, by golly, we're not going to harvest any more of them. We're just going to leave them there. Would that result in more carrots or fewer carrots? And of course, the owners of the land that are planting carrots, if they found out they had no market for them, they wouldn't plant them anymore. They do something else to the land. And and so what intuitively sounds like a great idea and a great way to save trees um, is really very likely not how things would turn out. And we're seeing that a little bit in real time right now in the U.S. Southeast. There is a softening of the paper market as we've gone to electronic communication. That in turn is pressuring, is affecting markets for pulp and other kinds of things. And that in turn is having an effect on some landowners now, which have resisted giving up land for urbanization, are now converting. It's part of the dynamic, an ongoing dynamic of pressures in how land should be used. So just to conclude, transitioning away from wood-based fiber involves significant challenges that are very often oversimplified in discussions. And it's really sometimes taken on faith that tree-free paper is a low environmental impact to wood-based paper. But as I've tried to show here, analysis suggests very careful analysis is needed before reaching a conclusion like that. And for my own part, having gone through that kind of exercise, it looks to me like this is, at least in the case of paper making, is just not the case at all. um, Research to identify better, lower cost, environmentally superior raw materials for all kinds is ongoing and essential. For one thing, we need to continue to look for um, natural fiber, renewable fiber that can begin to replace some of the synthetic fiber, the petroleum-based fiber we're using. But whatever is being considered, systematic comprehensive assessment is critical, no matter what comparison is being made, to avoid unintended consequences and adverse incomes. The bottom line, from my point of view, Trees and true forest-based products and non-tree-based products have differing environmental impacts, but the choice of tree-based products can strengthen investments in sustainable forest management, help create forests and trees in the forest. Um, it's a sensible way to go. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. And as we said before, you can add your Q&A question or your questions to the Q&A box. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark to get us started with our discussion.
Okay, we have a few questions lined up here, Jim. If hemp for paper is significantly expanded, or any agriculture product for that matter, where would it go? Where would it be planted? Would it displace current agriculture land, or would it, is there enough vacant land out there? What are
Well,
your thoughts?
yeah, thanks, Mark. If if uh, if hemp were to be planted to the extent that would be needed to completely replace fiber used in paper, and remember that would be a little less than half of the fiber that's used in paper, it would take somewhere around 10 million acres. If the goal were to go after all of the fiber, in other words, produce enough long fiber that would replace all of the fiber used in boxboard, then it would require a great many more acres than just 10 million. So then the question is, well, where would that land come from? It's not like there is a great deal of empty land just sitting around waiting for somebody to come up with some idea of what they might want to plant on it. So, as you suggest in your question, it would replace something else. Would it be a food crop? Would it be pine? Would it be hardwoods? Probably wouldn't replace too much in the way of pine, simply because pine likes sandy, well-drained soils, and hemp needs or favors a little bit heavier soil. But in any case, yeah, there would be a substitution someplace. And again, then the question comes back from an environmental point of view: is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And so we've just kind of gone through some of the options here.
Another kind of a combined question, flax, bamboo, or other products that are listed as replacement for tree-free paper. Any thoughts on that? Any research on that?
There's been a lot of research into alternative fiber, and uh, for example, straw. There's a company in California that makes straw-based paper, and it's good paper and so forth, and they're actually using crop residue, and that's a type of paper that makes quite a bit of sense if straw is readily available and their market's close enough and the mill is in that close location. Why, sure, that can be done. Um, um, so there are certainly alternative sources of fiber, but then you come back to the question of is that a better alternative than what we're doing now, given the likely impact on forests, as I kind of talked about right at the end of my presentation. Um, so short answer, there's a lot of ways to make paper, but the question is, what's the best way to do it? Now, another thing I'd say about straw, by the way, is straw is a commodity that in itself is, straw bales and sources of straw for farmers actually has been in something in short supply over the last few years. There's been quite an increase in cost and so forth in competition for that straw. So even with straw, it's not as if there's just billions and billions of tons of this stuff sitting around waiting to be used. And then some of it is left on the soil for conservation tillage as well.
The comparisons in your presentation were, pretty much related to high production of feedstock, stuff like that. Um, what about the harder to measure, like ecosystem services, comparing um, forests versus even natural forests with lower yields, comparing those to agriculture?
I guess if we're talking about ecosystem services, we're talking about the value of the land as a water filter. We're talking about hunting value. We're talking about the use of land for bird watching and all kind of hiking and everything else. And I think if you think through those various kinds of things, um, a an ecosystem dominated by trees, which is the definition of a forest, even if those trees are planted trees, a forest scores pretty high in pretty much any category you would talk about with respect to ecosystem services, as opposed to a intensively farmed agricultural field. Now, people certainly hunt uh, after crops are harvested and so forth in agricultural fields and so on. But I think if you look at the full suite of ecosystem services, and let's focus on water quality for a minute. On the one hand, we'd be comparing a site that has been exposed to a fairly heavy, chemically intense fertilizer, herbicide regime, as opposed to an area of land that hasn't been. Um, so I think you could kind of make your own conclusions there.
We have a question here that was submitted. What is the duration of carbon sequestration and how long can carbon remain stored in the soil profile?
Well, okay, that's an interesting question. Um, Soil carbon, a lot of soil carbon exists in the first couple of meters, first 3 feet or so of soil. That's actually about 40%, 45% of soil carbon is there. And that would include in a forest, for example, the leaves, the litter, and then things just directly below. And then there is something called deep soil carbon, which can go on a soil layer pretty much down to a heavy clay boundary. And that that carbon can sit there for hundreds, even thousands of years. Um, so the answer to that question is kind of hard to answer. That the carbon in that upper several meters is in flux all the time. If you have carbon for example, a farm field, that carbon accumulates during the time the plant is growing, and then when the plant is harvested and the soil is turned up, that carbon is released. If that land is instead a natural grassland with deep-rooted plants, then you would get soil carbon accumulation that would continue to accumulate over a long period of time. If that is a forest, you'd have soil carbon accumulation up to the point of harvest. Then at the point of harvest, tree roots and so forth remain in the soil, but nonetheless, some carbon is released upon that harvest. And then as the site is reforested, which in a plantation would usually be done within a year, in a case of natural regeneration and forest would take longer, but on the other hand, there's a lot of volunteer plants that begin to come in to repopulate the site. In any case, uh, so I guess what I'm saying is there's a ebb and flow of carbon, and some of the carbon lasts a long time. Some of it is constantly in flux.
We have a comment. In all of these comparisons, it's not the what, it's the how. Would you want to react to that?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
It's more of a comment, I guess.
Okay. Um, yeah, I don't know how to answer a question, so maybe I'll pass.
I can chime in. I mean, I think, I think it is, I mean, what I hear in that comment is when we make, I think it relates to what you said in your presentation, Jim, is it's not so much is bamboo better than something else or trees better. It's not the what, it's not the material, it's how it's produced that matters. And maybe even where it's produced, where in the landscape and what those methods of production are. And so I think when we just pit materials against each other, we're missing the production impacts, which I think is what your presentation really spoke to.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And you mentioned bamboo in your response there, and I'll just comment on that. You'll see comments about bamboo. There's a lot of promotion of bamboo for all kinds of stuff. It's the latest, greatest, And bamboo's an amazing thing. I've been in a lot of bamboo plantations around the world. And you look at those things and it's like, holy smokes, these things really grow fast. But on the other hand, a lot of that promotion, just like I've talked about with respect to hemp, some fairly amazing claims are made about the speed with which these bamboo grows and the yield and so forth. And then the same kind of advertisement will say, and bamboo never needs uh, irrigation or pesticides or herbicides. Well, so then you get into the weeds, which Dovetail has done, I think, in at least 2 and maybe 3 different reports we've done over the years. We really looked into this and found that, yes, you get these fantastic yields, but you only get those yields if you heavily fertilize and use pesticides and everything else. So you have to be careful when you're looking at, just like anything else, let the buyer beware. If you're seeing a lot of claims, you should never take those at face value. You really need to get into the weeds and see what's true and what isn't.
I have a question here. What are the marketing budgets of the non-tree fiber industry versus the paper products industry? Seems like the public will decide based on how things are marketed, whether it's true or not. If the non-tree based fiber lobby is strong, then these points might not ever reach the consumer.
Well, that's a good point, and I don't have a clue as to what the advertising budgets would be, but I would guess the tree-free industry, to the extent it exists, is very small. So I would guess that their marketing budget is far smaller than would exist for paper. I think what the comment indicates is true, that people's perception of what is true is more important than what actually is true. And that's an unfortunate reality, but so yeah, I agree with the statement, but I can't answer the question about size of budgets.
There's a question here. What source and method was used for the Old Testament? Now, I'm guessing that means when that
What
was
type of
written.
paper? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm guessing
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
So Mark, say that again. What sourcing method?
What source and method was used for the Old Testament? I'm guessing, what was
Yeah.
originally written?
I don't know that.
What is it? What is it, the word called? Papyrus? How do you pronounce it, Jim? Wasn't it
Papyrus?
Papyrus. Thank you. I never know how to pronounce it.
But I do know that there is a claim out there on the web right now that I've seen in a couple of places that says that hemp was used, that the original Constitution was written on hemp, and that's not true at all. I mean, somebody made that up in their living room, but it's out there now, and so it's at some point, if that's continued long enough, it will become true, I suppose.
Jim, did you just tell us that not everything on the internet is true? Did I hear you right there?
I've somehow gotten that idea. Yeah, I don't know.
Here's a comment. I'm a strong proponent for active forest management, but can you speak to the strategic use of high impact, high production fiber crops in settings that are less ecologically sensitive and might help relieve non-sustainable demands from local forests? I'm thinking of something similar to the triad approach to forest management.
Yeah, the very high intensity management of pulpwood stands, and in the United States, we've seen this particularly in the Southeast. I've been down in Brazil and seen the eucalypt plantations there, where trees are grown to a height, 6, 7, 8 times my height in a period of 6 years. What are kind of amazing things. The popularity of that kind of thing has begun to wane a little bit. And in the United States, part of that waning is because of the fact that the paper markets are softening because of a shift to electronic communications. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but to me, a good development is the idea that land managers are beginning to think about lengthening rotations to manage to also include management for carbon in a more directed way than has been done in the past. But so anyway, I'll say that. The other thing is, though, that plantations worldwide, the entire forest site worldwide, plantations make up somewhere around 8% of the total forest area worldwide, and yet produce something around a third of all fiber harvested for human use. So you look at that, and I ask myself as I look at that, is that a good thing or a bad thing? On the one hand, it takes pressure off forests, and there are some areas of the world in particular where that taking pressure off forests is helping to allow countries to look at the forest in a different way and to begin setting some of that land aside. In a place like the United States, intensive management of that kind is reducing pressure on forests at the same time that forests across the United States desperately need thinning. We talked about this increase in volume. One of the reasons for these increasingly intense forest fires that we're seeing is that we have more biomass out there than historically has been there for a very, very long time. And so anyway, I have mixed emotions about the benefits of plantations.
We've got a new question here. Is paper more or less sustainable to share information than digital server farms?
That's a very interesting question, and it's one that Dovetail may actually dive into here within the next year. We've talked about it. You look at the environmental impact of these data centers, and we're just now beginning to wake up to the idea that, wait a minute, all this stuff we're doing every day and these searches on Google and Facebook and everything isn't free by any choice, by any means. And the cost to us in terms of energy consumption has been hidden for a very long time, and now it's come into the full view. I don't know how to answer that question, except to say I think, and I very much look forward into getting into the weeds on this question, actually. I very much suspect when we really look into this, we may come to a different conclusion than society has reached to this point in time.
So Jim, do you think, it's always these days the world of absolutes, it's either hemp or it's wood, is there room for both?
Well, there certainly is room for both on a specialty market basis. And there's also room for both, 97% of the paper in the world is made out of wood. But at the same time, we talked about at the beginning that historically, there are areas of the world that don't really have that much in the way of forests that have used something else in the past. Those areas certainly make sense that if there are possibilities to use crop residues in a better way than they are now, maybe not used at all, and to put that into some kind of paper market makes a whole lot of sense. And actually, I would expect to see that happen as we go forward. We're going to see the same thing actually on the structural product side. I think I wrote a paper with a fellow from Weyerhaeuser some time ago and looked at use of straw residues and making a substitute for particle board and things like that. It's technically possible, and there are areas where it would make a lot of sense. So yes.
And the last question we have queued here is, what is the value of 1 acre to the logging industry?
Katie, can you answer that question?
Of course.
It certainly varies with respect to whatever
Yes.
you're,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Oh, exactly what you said, Jim. It's gonna, I mean, and Mark knows this as a land manager too. It depends. It absolutely depends. What's on that acre? What is the distance to the mill? All kinds of factors will determine what that value is. And that means if you are a landowner looking to sell timber, get more than one bid. That's what that means. Don't take the first number that someone puts to you. Get a good appraisal and get some competitive bids, but do your homework because that number can vary a lot.
But
So,
Mark, you were involved in a lot of timber sales and things. What would you say in Minnesota? What would you say?
Exactly what Katie said. You know, it varies. And I think it makes sense to get competitive bids because especially on private land, because I remember cases where people would come in and say, geez, this logger ripped me off. And I said, well, what did you have in your management plan or your guidance for him? Well, I just told him to go cut what he wanted out there, and it didn't end up the way I wanted it to look. So I think that's another aspect is, you know, people are hesitant to go out and get assistance, but I think it's very important, unless you're an expert in forestry, to get that outside assistance, and that can determine the value as well.
Well,
exactly.
thank you, Mark. Thank you, Jim. And thank you, Katie, for this discussion. Before we end our session, we had participants from the Q3 or Q2 webinar vote on our Q4 topic. So we would like you all to vote on those top choices. We compiled all the results together and put them in a poll. So if you don't mind, take a few moments to cast your vote for that topic. We will announce our Q4 topic at our next webinar, which is on September 5th. So I'm going to give you guys a few minutes just to vote on which ones you would like us to talk about. I see some votes coming in. Thank you for taking the time to vote for that. And thank you for joining us today. We'd love to see you at our upcoming webinars later this year. You can register using the link we've shared in the chat. And we'll follow up with an email that contains the recording of this session, a registration link for our future webinars, and a feedback survey for this webinar. You can reply to the email if you have questions or other feedback, or you can easily email us at info@dovetailinc.org. As a nonprofit, we strive to keep these webinars accessible to everyone by not requiring a registration fee. So if you find value in our work and are in a position to support us, we invite you to consider making a donation to Dovetail. Every contribution, big or small, helps us continue offering these resources like our reports and these webinars. You can find the donation link in the chat and at the Dovetail website. And once again, thank you so much for being here, and we hope to see you at the next session on September 5th.